Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer 3 Kane's Wrath for PC and Xbox 360. This is the expansion pack to the real-time strategy game Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars. It was developed by EA Los Angeles and published in March of 2008 for PC, and then it later got released on Xbox 360. And like CNC3, it got a fairly mixed reception, with some people praising it, other people not praising it, fans being a bit divided on it, and it was really just kind of a footnote in the Command & Conquer series history. So the question ultimately becomes, is this worth picking up, and what does it really add to Command & Conquer 3? Because, let's face it, I was not impressed by Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars. It's not a bad game, but it's just bland and uninteresting, and even worse, it felt kind of archaic when it came out in 2007. So, what does Kane's Wrath do to spruce things up and really change things over the original Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars? Because it does change things up a fair bit. Well, as far as presentation goes, there's really nothing to speak of because it's exactly the same as Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars. It's still got the cheesy FMV cutscenes, it's still got Joseph Kukan as Kane, when he still does a great job as Kane, of course.
Together we will show the world's downtrodden who the real enemy is. GDI promises them prosperity, but in the slums of Rio, the homeless and hungry know the truth. They have been forgotten.
And as far as the new content goes, it looks about on par with what the original game had, so there's not really all that much to speak of there. But what they did change is the sound design. Now, they did add in a few new units, so they do of course have voice acting to go along with that, and that's fine. But the big change that you will notice if you've played Command & Conquer 3 is that it's almost like they recognized the mistake they made with Command & Conquer 3, in that the soundtrack was just blatantly un-Command & Conquer. It just didn't feel like a Command & Conquer game in terms of its soundtrack. And it certainly didn't feel in the same continuity as the Tiberium series, because you didn't have that kind of industrial, electronic, and yet at the same time very, very slightly dark kind of music like you did in the previous games, Tiberian Sun and of course the original Command & Conquer. And then you start up the campaign, and this is the first song you hear when you actually start up Mission 1. That should give you a general idea of how the soundtrack is, but I think it's interesting that they picked Act on Instinct to remix for Kane's Wrath, considering it's one of the most iconic songs in the entire series, apart from things like Hell March, of course. But it's just refreshing to hear them kind of try to go back to the roots of the series in some regards with this, and really try to bring back more of that kind of rock or industrial sound. But it's kind of hit or miss in Kane's Wrath. Some of the tracks are actually pretty good, and some of them are like the Act on Instinct remix, which is a pretty solid remix, but it could be better. And then there's other songs that just kind of fall flat, but at least it's more Command & Conquer-y than just base Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars soundtrack, so that actually lends quite a bit to it. But as refreshing as that is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is actually kind of interesting because there's only one campaign this time around, and it's purely a Brotherhood of Nod campaign. It focuses on basically Kane rising from the ashes after the Second Tiberium War, which is the events of Tiberian Sun and Firestorm, and rebuilding the Brotherhood as it was splintered and went off into numerous sub-factions. And so it's basically Kane reuniting the Brotherhood under his banner, and of course setting forth his plans that would bring about the massive war in Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars, and set up events for the future sequel, Command & Conquer 4 Tiberian Twilight. But that's frankly better left for the CNC4 review, and don't worry, that is coming soon, so stay tuned for that. But the actual plot in this is split into 3 different acts. The first of them is set after the events of Tiberian Sun and Firestorm. The second act is basically the lead up to and during the Third Tiberium War, or CNC3's storyline. And then the last act is basically picking up the pieces after that war. And it all focuses on Kane's efforts to bring his plans to fruition, and some of it is actually very interesting. And then you get to the ending, and it's just like, wait, what? It's kind of insane and nonsensical, and frankly kind of stupid. But apart from that, it does a fairly decent job of keeping you engrossed in it, and if you care at all about the Tiberium series storyline, then you'll probably want to at least go through that. The campaign itself is actually 13 missions, and like I said, it's all Brotherhood of Nod stuff. But one thing I did notice is that at times it can feel slightly unfair. And it feels like that they just stack the deck against you incredibly quickly with things that you pretty much couldn't have anticipated to begin with. And then it just requires some trial and error to actually get through, which is frankly kind of irritating. But ultimately, the campaign is doable, and if you are a C&C fan and you want to go through the continuation of the story, then you can certainly do so with Kane's Wrath and come away from it fairly reasonably satisfied, at the very least. So there's that. But then there's the other things that they changed up going from just plain Tiberium Wars to Kane's Wrath. They added in something called the Global Conquest mode, which is replaced by the Kane's Challenge mode on Xbox 360. Obviously, I don't have the Xbox 360 version, but what I do know is that Kane's Challenge is basically like the General's Challenge in Command & Conquer Generals. But Global Conquest is kind of interesting in that it's got a global turn-based map where you have these different bases that are scattered throughout the world, and you can build strike forces and send them off to conquer enemy bases and things like that. And of course, you can build up new bases, and the objective is different depending on which faction you're playing. And it's kind of an interesting twist to the gameplay, but it does get pretty repetitive pretty quickly. And the actual turn-based strategy part of it is pretty minimalistic. So what it's really going to be doing is just setting up a series of skirmishes that you then go through, and some of them will actually complete very, very quickly. So that actually gets kind of awkward when that happens, because you're not necessarily expecting it to end as quickly as it does, and yet it does. So you're like, oh, okay, whatever, and then you just kind of continue on. And like I said, it is an interesting change of pace, and it's kind of weird that they threw it into a Command & Conquer game, because I've seen this kind of thing in other games before, for example, Rise of Nations, but it just doesn't really feel like it fits very well in Command & Conquer. And then you actually go to the gameplay changes that they made to base Tiberium Wars. And what you're going to find is they basically pulled a Command & Conquer Generals on it. What do I mean by that? Well, each faction now has 2 sub-factions, which are more specialized variants of the units and powers and such that a faction is going to get, some of which actually have straight-up unique units. For example, the Steel Talons for the GDI get the classic Titan Walkers and Wolverine Walkers instead of Predator tanks and things like that. And they have their own specific playstyle, as does the other faction for the GDI called Zocom, which gets the unique unit of Zone Raiders, among other things, which is kind of interesting. But again, each faction has 2 sub-factions. So you've got Zocom and the Steel Talons for the GDI, you've got the Black Hand and the Marked of Kane for Nod, and then for the Skrin you have Reaper 17 and Traveler 59. Again, each of which has their own specific playstyle that is a subset of what you would be doing if you're just playing the general faction, which is still an option. So it's pretty much exactly how it was when 0 Hour introduced the idea of multiple generals for the various factions in Command & Conquer Generals. But this time around, they narrowed it down. And it's definitely an interesting gameplay change, but it's not wildly different. And what you're ultimately going to find is that while these sub-factions give you opportunities if you're playing a very specific strategy to begin with, and these just happen to coincide with it, they don't really do enough to wildly change up the game and make this thing feel like it's just redefines the actual game. Again, it feels like they've just copy-pasted from Generals. And that was something that happened in Command & Conquer 3 as well. It's pretty much copy-pasted gameplay from Command & Conquer Generals. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, it's starting to feel really archaic as of Kane's Wrath. So, what I end up with Kane's Wrath is this sense of just not only just being unimpressed, but ultimately I can't really get into it. And that was something that I had a problem with in Command & Conquer 3 as well. I couldn't really get into it. It's not a bad game, and Kane's Wrath is not a bad expansion pack. If you liked Command & Conquer 3, I would say that Kane's Wrath is something that you should get. You'll probably be able to get a fair amount of enjoyment out of it. And if you are going to try to pick up Command & Conquer 3, I recommend getting it as well as Kane's Wrath, so you have a complete experience to go off of. But as an expansion pack in and of itself, it's just fairly average, really. Worth having if you can pick it up for a decent price and you already own Command & Conquer 3, but I wouldn't say it's a must-own, per se. You can probably skip it if you weren't really all that into Command & Conquer 3 to begin with. I give it a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.